Welcome to the Future Tech edition of the Finding Genius podcast. Forget frequently asked questions, forget common sense, common knowledge, or Googling for information. How about advice from a genius in their field instead? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5% go above and beyond. They become very good at what they do, but only 0.1% are the geniuses of their profession. Richard has made it his life's mission to interview the geniuses of their fields in areas such as AI, 3D printing, quantum computing, blockchain and Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out on amazing podcasts with geniuses. Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen, and go to futuretech.findinggeniuspodcast.com and subscribe today.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, Future Tech edition. I have Ronald Merrill. He's a professor and an author. He has a book called Our Magnetic Earth, the Science of Geomagnetism. He's a professor emeritus in the Earth and Space Science Department at the University of Washington. So, Ron, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so what is geomagnetism, for the layperson? What's it about?
Well, the magnetism, of course, is a broad field that covers all the way from physics to geology. And in my case, I'm interested in Earth's magnetic field and its properties in the past, what creates it, what's going on today, and a whole bunch of related problems such as animals use the magnetic field, some animals to navigate, and how do they do this, and so on.
Yeah, I've heard that animals use it. What are some examples, and how do they appear to use Earth's magnetic field?
Okay, well, I got into this business in a strange way. A student, Tom Quinn, who's now a professor in fisheries at the University of Washington, approached me and wanted to study salmon and the possibility that they sense the magnetic field. I thought this was a silly idea, frankly. This was a long time ago. I thought he'd work for many years and not come up with any results. But he dragged me into this business by telling me that his advisor worked with sockeye salmon, one of the species of salmon in the Pacific Northwest, and that these salmon, when they were born, the small ones, what I called minnows, he called them fry, they have to go to a freshwater lake and spend a year before they go out to the oceans. But somehow they knew what the lake was upstream or downstream right at birth. And Quinn wanted to show that they could use the magnetic field to find this lake. And eventually he devised a scheme to do this. He had a four-arm trap in which salmon swam in 1 to 4 different directions. And I showed him how he could build a magnetic field around this trap and to change the direction of the magnetic field. And when he changed the direction of the magnetic field by 90 degrees, the salmon would swim in a different direction by 90 degrees. But this only happened at night and when the traps were covered. During the daytime, they were using some other mechanism for navigation, probably the sun, which is polarized, much like you see in polarized sunglasses. That's a long...
So at night, they were somehow innately sensing the magnetic field, but in the daytime, you think it's through their eyes that they were getting a signal from the polarized light of the sun? That's
the hypothesis. Actually, many animals sense the magnetic field, by the way. There's We use different senses. When we cross a road, for example, we look both ways, but we also listen. And the salmon, in this case, we're using probably different senses. Birds use a variety of senses. They even use the stars to navigate. So there's many senses that animals use to navigate and orient themselves.
I've heard that the Earth's magnetic field is very weak. So can you give me an example of the relative scale of how strong or weak the Earth's magnetic field is?
Well, the magnetic field is very weak. It's to give you an example, a hand magnet is stronger than most hand magnets than the magnetic field. It's about half a Gauss, if that means anything, the magnetic field. And there are some problems because you have electric wires will have magnetic fields associated with them and so on. And so somehow the salmon are able to overcome all these other fields and navigate. Their main tool of navigation, by the way, is an olfactory sense. They smell the water in the river. So when they go out to the ocean and come back, they use a chemical sense, smelling it, rather than the magnetic field. And Thomas thinks that when they're out in the ocean, however, making the long navigation from Seattle up to Alaska and back, he thinks that they may be using the magnetic field. But this is a problem because you have to have a map view. The magnetic field varies from one place to another. It's not a simple magnetic field where you just go north. Here, our declination is off by about 20 degrees from pure north, and that changes as you go on a navigation route. This may be very complicated for your listeners. Perhaps a simpler example is something called magnetotactic bacteria. These are single-celled organisms that live in mud, and they're buoyant. They want to live just in a certain area in the mud where the oxygen level is just right. And how do they find this? They can't use gravity, and they have been shown to use a magnetic field. You can take these bacteria, put them under a microscope, put a magnet next to the microscope, and they'll swim one way. Flip the magnet over 180 degrees, it'll swim the other way. They look inside these bacteria, and they find there's little particles of a mineral called magnetite. And these particles are just the right size to maximize the magnetic field strength. So these particles are sensing the magnetic field. They're forced on the magnetic field and somehow know which way to swim. So they swim up or down, and the magnetic field has an inclination. So they're using the inclination of this magnetic field to move up and down in these sediments to find an optimum level to live. Again, a very complicated answer to your question.
Has science figured out how? So they have like these little particles that respond to the magnetic field. So do the particles line up on one side of a cell of the bacterial wall, and that's how they know, or like what's the mechanism by which they navigate?
They're in a long chain called a magnetosome, and there may be 15 or 20 of these in this magnetosome lined up. And just like if you put two magnets together, there's a torque on them. How the bacteria actually sense it is going into biology, which is not my field. But clearly, they must be sensing this in some way, because it's something you don't even need statistics for. If you put these bacteria under a microscope and you put on a magnetic field, they all swim one way. You turn the magnetic field around 180 degrees, they all swim the other way. But that's not the only way.
What happens if you have an AC current? It's going back and forth. It's changing, so I would think it would create a magnetic field that would be changing direction at a certain frequency, right?
That's correct. And in fact, you can take these magnetic crystals in there, and you can remagnetize them by putting on magnetic fields in the opposite direction and follow up the system. And when you do that, the bacteria can't find which way is up and down in their sediments.
So what is it called when a magnetic field changes over time? I guess they have their own frequencies, and is there a name for that? A changing magnetic field over time?
Well, the magnetic field is changing all the time at the Earth's magnetic field, and we can put on very magnetic fields to, very strong fields up to hundreds, thousands of Gauss, much stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. In fact, we use superconducting magnetometers to do this. When we talk about the Earth's magnetic field changing, we call it secular variation. And that is changing because of the Earth's main magnetic field comes from the core of the Earth. 4,000 miles is the radius of the Earth, and it's about halfway down to the core. It's liquid, and it's like a generator which generates a magnetic field. And this magnetic field is changing all the time because the core is moving about and carrying the magnetic field with it. So I'm not certain when you talk about the changes of the magnetic field. how to describe this. The Earth's magnetic field itself actually has reverse polarity. That means that the north magnetic pole and the south magnetic pole has swapped places. It takes about 3,000 years or so to do this, and it's happened hundreds of times in the past. The last time was 780,000 years ago, and it brings up an interesting question related to animals. When the Earth's magnetic field reverses, how does the animals adjust and evolve to know that the magnetic field is changing?
That would probably change their migratory patterns, and then it would lead maybe to their extinction. I would think, I wonder if there's a mass extinction correlated with a change in the Earth's magnetic field direction.
Actually, that was a question that several people worked on back in the late 20th century, and that was a hypothesis that the reversal of the magnetic field might cause extinctions. And two scientists in Europe examined the problem with regard to the what's called the Cretaceous tertiary extinction, which occurred 66 million years ago, and is now thought to be associated with an asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula. But at the time, this was not known in the 70s when they first did this, and they went out and found the extinction did not coincide with any magnetic reversals, and subsequently that hypothesis has been put to rest. In fact, we were asked to write a review article for the Journal of Science, my colleague Phil McFadden and I, 15 or 20 years ago, when we summarized this, summarize the data and show that the extinctions did not occur at magnetic reversal boundaries. The magnetic reversals are recorded in rocks, by the way.
Oh, really? Okay. Has anyone tried to document in a lab to see if you have an animal that's exposed to the reverse magnetic field when it should, but there's other cues that are telling it it's going the wrong way? Maybe it adapts over time. Has that been observed?
Yeah, that has been done. And it's been done with several different animals. In fact, animals all the way from bacteria up to some naked mole rats, I think, sense the magnetic field. Birds are best known, but one of the animals that are studied the most is fruit flies. And that's because they have a very simple nervous system, a very simple genetic system. And they take fruit flies and they put them in a magnetic field, and they teach them to go towards food, the sugar, along one passageway in one direction, and then they can reverse the magnetic field, and they'll go the opposite direction to find the food, to find the sugar. They've actually taught them how to do this. But these fruit flies do not have these magnetic particles, and it turns out that they are using a chemical sensor that is responds to light that affects the magnetic properties of a molecule and the chemical reactions. It's a complicated mechanism, but it only works when blue light is present. Again, a very long, complicated answer, but they can control. They can do controlled experiments to teach animals to sense the magnetic field, to find sources of food.
Do you think that magnetic sense extends to people or to all animals, or how many animals seem to have it?
Well, I can tell you some of the animals that have it. Turtles have it. Many bird species have a magnetic sense. Some bats have it as well as a sonar sense. Let me see what else has it. These mole rats have it. A lot of them haven't been done. When it comes to people, there are some fringe scientists that think that people might have a magnetic sense. I'm a skeptic on this one. There's a fellow by the name of Baker over in England that claims they have it, but when it's been tried to be duplicated in controlled conditions, it doesn't work. For example, if you put a person into a shielded room, so all the magnetic fields outside a room are gone, and inside a room you can produce a magnetic field. You put a person in a chair and you turn it in different directions, and you can change that or you can change the magnetic field, and the person can't sense the magnetic field. A professor at Caltech, Joe Kirschvink, has done those experiments, and he doesn't find that they can sense the magnetic field. Now, Kirschvink himself thinks that there may be that in the ancient times that primates might have been able to sense, mammals might have been able to sense the magnetic field. But this hasn't been demonstrated that any.
Well, maybe we can, but we just have to have a stronger signal, or maybe we can't. I don't know.
Yeah, that may be true, but the intensity of the magnetic field today of Earth's magnetic field is about the same as it's been for the last. It goes up and down, but it's in the range of within a factor of 10 for the last several millions of years, as longer than man has been around. It might be interesting to go back to see, like the Aborigines in Australia or something like that, whether they have a magnetic sixth sense, but nobody has done this.
Is it just for migration, long migration, or is magnetic field ever used for like day-to-day short movements, over small paths?
Well, it turns out that with the birds do navigate. Some birds actually go from one pole to the other pole, and they use several ways of navigating, but magnetic fields is thought to be one of them. Sharks also, they have a different way that they might sense a magnetic field. I won't go into that here, but I was down in South Africa and I learned of a shark called Nicole. It turns out it was named after Nicole Kidman, the actress, because she was fond for sharks. But they took this shark and they put on a tag on it, what's called a pop-up tag, that could be used to find where its location was, how deep it went, and so on. This shark, 3 months later, was found off the west coast of Australia. It had migrated that distance, and they found it because this pop-up tag was released. It goes to the surface where it is interrogated by satellites, and they found out where the shark was. And then 6 months later, this shark returned to South Africa to a place called False Bay, and they could identify it because of notches in its fins and so on. So somehow this shark was migrating thousands of miles all the way over to West Australia and back. They don't know for sure why it was migrating that far. They don't know how it was migrating that far. But they do know from experiments that were done in Hawaii that sharks can sense magnetic fields very sensitively, and they can you can train them to seek out food by changing the magnetic field. So it's a hypothesis. A lot of these things are speculative, not yet proved, but it's very plausible.
How do sharks migrate using magnetic fields? You said the mechanism was different. What's it like?
Well, it may be different. This is controversial. Some sharks seem to have magnetic particles in them, but they also have what are called organs called ampullae of Lorenzini. These are long tooths, many of them that are in the shark's head, and they conduct electricity very well. And salt water also conducts electricity very well. So you can make a circuit that goes through the shark's head. Now, if you take a coil of wire and you move it in a magnetic field, it will induce a current in this coil. So one of the speculations is that these sharks are, as they turn their heads in the magnetic field, are inducing currents that they somehow sense. The competitive mechanism that Joe Kirschvink, this professor at Caltech, believes is that they have magnetic particles in their head and are using that. And to my knowledge, the debate is still going on.
That's really interesting. Huh. But it seems to be when there's migratory behavior involved, that's when there's magnetosensing. But, I mean, are there other animals where it makes no sense that they would have the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field?
Well, I mean, I suppose that the more sensors we have and use, the better off we are. But turtles, for example, green turtles and loggerback turtles sense the magnetic field. Some of these are born in Florida beaches, and they're. By the way, I'm not a biologist, so I'm only on the side of this. I mean, I work more on the origin of magnetic field and reversals. But these turtles, they swim out around the Atlantic in a big loop, and they come back to the same place. And when they take the small turtles and put them in the magnetic fields to see which way they swim, by changing the inclination, they'll swim in different directions. So again, it appears that turtles have a magnetic sense and are using this for long-scale migrations. These migrations go all the way from Florida all the way across the Atlantic to the opposite side and back around the Sargasso Sea. They make a big loop. And they seem to do this instinctively. It seems to be that this magnetic sense is somehow programmed into their system at birth.
Yeah, well, again, it sounds like any animal that has to migrate uses magnetic sensing for that migration. That makes sense.
Yeah, not any animal. To my knowledge, the monarch butterflies do not use a magnetic field. That was one that was investigated, and it doesn't seem that they use it. They use some other mechanism for sensing the magnetic field. One of the earliest experiments were with starlings of birds in Scandinavia, and they took these birds, picked them up, and when they were and carried them down to Switzerland and released them. And usually these starlings went from Scandinavia to the British Isles. But when they took them down to Switzerland, they found that there was some of the starlings went to the British Isles, but the young ones that had never made the migration before went to Spain. They were using the magnetic field and exclusively to do that. But the older ones that went to the British Isles were using some other mechanism for navigation that overrode the magnetic field information. So again, birds and these animals seem to use more than one sense, just as we do. We have our five senses, and we use them. On crossing the road, as I said, we look and we listen.
If you were to visualize what a animal experiences, has anyone done that where they've tried to create a visual of what they would see? Are they literally seeing the Earth's magnetic field? Would it feel a tug, or like what do you imagine it would feel like?
Well, again, this is speculative. On these fruit flies, but also birds seem to use this photochemical sense in light. And what happens is it's a long molecule that has different orientations with respect to the magnetic field. And these different orientations, they'll have different rates of chemical reaction. And they find them in birds in the right eye, in many songbirds, but these molecules have different orientations. And so they're having different rates of chemical transmission, and the speculation is that in the eye, it may appear as dots, that the chemical rate of chemical reactions appear as either a dark dot or a lighter dot and so on, and you have a pattern of dots, and as the animal changes its orientation, this pattern in the eye changes, and that they're sensing this. But this is very speculative. If that's the case, these animals are actually seeing the magnetic field, these birds.
Yeah, I was just wondering how they experience it. So that's what they think is a series of dots in a pattern. Is it like a predominance of dots in a part of the visual field, or is it a specific pattern of the dots?
It would be the pattern of the dots. But again, I have to remind you, this is speculative. Nobody has shown that this is the case. But they have shown that these molecules, that these chemical rates do change, and the birds do sense the magnetic field. Again, if you go to other people, they claim that birds sense the magnetic fields by using magnetic particles in their brain. So, most of these mechanisms are the animals sense the magnetic fields. Many of these animals do. That has been demonstrated well. And some animals, they know for sure how they sense the magnetic field. The bacteria for sure do it by magnetic particles. Fruit flies do it by what's called cryptochrome, which is a molecule in their brain that has these long molecules inside that it's a protein, actually, cryptochrome. They have long molecules inside that give these spots in birds. But so fruit flies are not using magnetic particles. So there's more than one mechanism for sure that animals are using to sense the magnetic field. But for all other animals that I know of, it's controversial just which mechanism they're using. So fruit flies are using something that involves rate of chemical reactions in a magnetic field. Bacteria are using magnetic particles. And Joe Kirschrink, who's a friend of mine at Caltech, would disagree. He wants everything to be magnetic particles, but there's a lot of evidence by people elsewhere that there are other mechanisms that are involved in some of these animals.
Okay. Well, sorry we strayed so much into the biological area, but so in your particular research, what have you discovered what have you learned about the Earth's magnetic field that most people never talk about or is not common knowledge?
Well, when I talk to people about the origin of magnetic fields, their eyes glaze over. But what I guess in my work, one of the things I did was find out how rocks record the magnetic field better. But the other thing was concerned the magnetic field reversals, and that these reversals occur in time, but they're random. But there are long periods of time, as we find from looking at rocks, where the magnetic field has not reversed itself at all. From a period of 135 million years ago to 83 million years ago, the field never reversed. It had a normal polarity just as it does today. But these reversals occur randomly in time, but for some reason, the processes working in the core of the Earth will change over a very long time, so there's no reversals, and then there's times when there are reversals. This is different from the Sun, by the way. The Sun has a magnetic field that reverses polarity every 11 years. So it's periodic, boom, boom, boom. Sometimes it's 8 years, sometimes 13, but on the average it's every 11 years. But the Earth's magnetic field is not reversing in a periodic fashion, and there are theories now that have been developed on computers using big words like magnetic hydrodynamics, which are very mathematical theories, in which you can show that under some conditions the magnetic fields will reverse periodically, depending on movements of fluids, and in other conditions they will be random, like we have in the Earth. So we've dealt with these kind of problems and how the conditions in the core and how the conditions in the Sun, which we didn't work on, but how they can vary so that we can see these regularity of reversals or non-regularity.
Oh, well, yeah. What does change the Earth's magnetic field? Why does it change? And can you predict when and how?
Okay, yeah, let me, there are two ways you can have magnetism. One is by permanent magnets, and they're, when you heat these magnets up, they lose their magnetization. They're not magnetized anymore. And then the Earth is too hot in the center to have any permanent magnetization. The second way is by electric currents. And if you take a current traveling along a wire and put your right thumb along the direction of this current, your fingers will curl around the wire in the direction of a magnetic field. So whenever you have a current, you also have a magnetic field. And in the subject of what we call dynamo, which is the origin of magnetic field, it's effectively electric generator that we're taking movements of fluid, mechanical movements of fluid, to generate electric currents and to magnify these. So the core of the Earth, which is down to 2,000 miles, is divided into inner core, which is solid, and an outer liquid core that is convecting, just like boiling water on a stove, only it's made of iron and nickel. And it's turbulent, and it's moving around, and it's producing a whole bunch of electric currents. And because it's moving around and producing these electric currents, which are associated with magnetic fields, the magnetic fields are always moving around. And when we're far away from them, at the Earth's surface, the magnetic field appears as if it's a bar magnet. It's not really. It's these electric currents. But about 75% of the field is this one bar magnet. The rest of the field is very complicated and is constantly moving. If you were to go to the North Magnetic Pole today, for example, that's where the field is vertical. It has an inclination, and it would be 90 degrees down. That part of the field is changing very rapidly. It's changing tens of miles a year, its position. But if you go to the South Magnetic Pole, it's not 180 degrees away. That's not moving very fast at all. And that's because besides this main field, which is like a bar magnet, 25% of the field is due to these very complex electric currents close to the outer boundary of the core, and they're changing very rapidly. So if you have a compass and you're moving around and on there, say the Iraq boundary borderline, you better be careful.
So in the aggregate, because we're far away from the Earth's core, we observe it as less varied than it actually is? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what happens is, again, this is very complicated. The further away we get from the core, the more it looks like a single magnet with a dipole, two poles, north and south. The closer that we get to the Earth's core, the more complicated it looks. And because we're, a couple thousand miles away from the surface of the Earth's core, we get a part of it which looks like a bar magnet and another part that doesn't. But remember, these are not magnets because there's no permanent magnets in the Earth's core at all. These are all due to electric currents. It's just a phenomenal way electricity and magnetism works.
So is it because that we have so many essentially competing magnets, or it's so fluid that the net magnetic field of the Earth is very low based on the amount of magnetic material in play? Is that why it's almost at neutral but slightly biased in one direction?
The crust and rocks do have magnetic fields, and they can affect things. But the main magnetic field is from this core from the Earth itself.
Since the Earth's magnetic field is so low, is that because it's almost in balance, but there's just a slight preferential slant towards one direction, and maybe that's why it can change direction at all, because there's not too much is needed to change it?
Well, the magnetic field can change in two different ways. One, I can let the intensity go to zero and build up the other way. The second way is I can rotate the magnetic field around 180 degrees. And it looks like different reversals have different properties in time, but it looks like both happen, that the intensity decreases somewhat, but the field becomes very complicated, what we call a non-dipole field. It's no longer a bar magnet. And this is easier seen in the sun, which reverses, as I said, every 11 years. During the middle reversal, there's no bar magnet appearance at all. It's just a very complicated magnetic field at the surface. So these are, this is why people's eyes glaze over when I talk to them about it. I mean, it's really a difficult mathematical physics subject. But if I may,
what about the origin of the Earth's magnetic field? What's your thoughts there?
Well, let me tell you an anecdote that will help it. There's William Gilbert is sometimes called the father of experimental physics. He was back in 1600. He was the royal physician for Queen Elizabeth I. And at that time, he decided he'd learn everything about magnetism, go through all the experiments that had ever been done, going all the way back to the Chinese that had compasses back thousands of years ago. And he would reproduce all these experiments. And he concluded that Earth had a magnetic field because it was a permanent magnet. it was magnetized. And he further concluded that the magnetism arose because it had a soul. Now, at the time, they didn't know about electric currents. Nobody had discovered electric currents. They weren't discovered until over 100 years later. So he was trying to solve a problem, trying to figure out something that was unsolvable because they didn't have the basic physics of the problem. And when now we think we have the basic physics of the problem, and we talk about the Earth's magnetic field being weak, but there's things that are much weaker. A bacteria has a magnetic field associated with these magnetic particles, but this doesn't compare to the Earth's magnetic field. There are stars called magnetars. They're neutron stars. These are stars made of neutrons that they're very dense. The diameter is only about the diameter of Chicago or something of that sort. But you take a sugar cube of a neutron star and it would weigh more than the Matterhorn. That's how dense they are. They're just made of neutrons. But they have intense magnetic fields, very large, million billion Gauss, a million billion times the Earth's magnetic field. And now you say, okay, well, what's the origin of this magnetic field? Well, guess what? People will say, well, maybe it's a dynamo, electric currents like the Earth and the sun and so on. And you say, but these fields are very, very large. The question comes up, maybe we're not ready to solve some of these problems. Maybe it's a mechanism that we still don't know.
Right. Well, Ron, I think this stuff is really fascinating, and unfortunately, we're out of time. But how can listeners begin to learn more about the Earth's magnetic field, about magnetic navigation by animals? What do you recommend that they do from here to learn more?
Well, this is being a little bit selfish. I would get my book, Our Magnetic Earth. It talks about the magnetic fields there. It talks about biological problems, magnetic resonance, imaging in there. It talks about the origin of magnetic field. It talks about how we know the composition of the Earth. It talks about solar wind and weather, magnetic field storms, things of this sort are all in that book. Yeah, I mean, all those, the theory of the origin of magnetic field, all those things are trying to be described in that book. When I was, I'm retired now, but when I was working, I wrote 2 high-level books for researchers in math and physics a lot. And this book, Our Magnetic Earth, was written with no equations. It was written at a Scientific American level and trying to explain about Earth's magnetic field, its properties, and so on, in a way that an intelligent layman might be able to understand it. But that's a selfish thing. You can also find a whole bunch of articles in places like Scientific American and Discover Magazine and so on.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, Ron, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been a great call.
I hope it was useful, and it was enjoyable talking to you, Richard. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Future Tech edition of the Finding Genius podcast. This podcast is information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen, and subscribe today by going to futuretech.findinggeniuspodcast.com.